The heavy stench of gunpowder smoke mingles with the cloying reek of disemboweled horses. A thick autumn fog crawls across the trampled fields, mercifully veiling the scale of the disaster. How much does a geopolitical blunder weigh? Sometimes it weighs exactly as much as the severed head of a commander-in-chief, tossed like a rotten melon at the feet of an arrogant brat on a throne. What would you feel, standing on this blood-soaked earth, knowing your commander is dead and the empire has left you to be torn apart? By the end of 1620, the Moldovan steppes had been transformed into a vast mass grave. The fields of Chikora are generously fertilized with the flesh of winged hussars and infantrymen of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Impact, breakthrough, panic. The Turkish juggernaut has just ruthlessly crushed Polish ambitions. Grand Crown Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski, a living icon, the man who took Moscow, is dead. His gray head, impaled on a pike, is bound for Istanbul as a grim souvenir for Sultan Osman II. What remains of the army is trampled, shackled, or rotting in damp trenches. You're lying in this freezing slush. Air wheezes from a punctured lung. Cold slowly crawls from numb legs to your chest. Someone's heavy iron-shod boot steps on your hand, snapping bones, but you no longer have the strength to scream. You stare into the gray sky, realizing the absolute pointlessness of your death. You are just a crossed-out digit in a report that will soon land on the king's polished desk. While the bloody dust settled on one bank of the Dniester, 1,000 kilometers north, in the warm halls of Warsaw, a different kind of storm was brewing. A storm of bureaucratic terror. That paralyzing primal fear that grips men in velvet doublets when they realize there is no one left to protect them from real butchers. The same seethed like a disturbed hive. Magnates, who just yesterday were divvying up offices and lands, now shouted themselves hoarse, blaming each other for the catastrophe. The scratch of quill pens on parchment sounded like the grinding of saw teeth. King Sigismund III Vasa gripped the armrests of his throne until his knuckles turned white, staring into the void. The bureaucratic machine groaned, choking on its own helplessness, trying to halt approaching death with paper decrees. The southern border has been erased. The road to the heart of Europe is wide open. The vast Ottoman Empire smelled fear and was already massing colossal forces for the final blow. Decisions are made in hysteria. Meetings last through the night by the light of guttering candles in the stifling air of locked halls. A plug must be found for this gaping hole. A shield is needed, capable of withstanding the battering ram of an empire. They need a man who can be thrown into the meat grinder to save the crown. And they find him. Who does the terrified elite send to stop the greatest military machine of its time? A healthy, vigorous strategist? A hero at his peak? No. They choose a dead man. Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, an old man, a legendary commander whose body is currently being consumed from the inside by a terminal illness. Royal messengers burst into his chambers in the middle of the night. They literally drag the fading hetman out of bed. A dry cough tears at his chest, leaving red spots on his handkerchief. His hands shake from exhaustion, but the monarch's order brooks no refusal. He is handed the hetman's mace, which at that moment looks more like a heavy grave cross. The cynicism of absolute power knows no bounds. Those hiding behind stone palace walls are always ready to pay for their geopolitical mistakes with someone else's blood, especially if that blood is about to dry up anyway. The old man is sent to the slaughterhouse to buy time. Emergency taxes are wrung out of the peasantry with ruthless cruelty. Villages empty before one's eyes. Forges work around the clock, monotonically forging steel for soldiers, 9 out of 10 of whom will never return home. All of Europe watches the death throes of the Commonwealth with icy horror. The Papal See sends prayers and chests of gold in a panic, clearly understanding, if this shaky frontier falls, muezzins will call for prayer in the squares of Vienna and Rome. This is not an organized preparation for war. This is the architecture of total despair. As one diplomat of those events wrote, his trembling hand tracing ink lines, "Death already stood at our doorstep, and there was not a man in the capital whose mind was not clouded by the premonition of the end." Words soaked in hopelessness. The politicians in Warsaw understood. It wasn't just an enemy army approaching from the south. It was a natural disaster crushing continents. The ailing Chodkiewicz struggles to mount his warhorse. Every movement echoes with sharp pain in his joints. His hastily assembled army begins a grueling march south toward the banks of the Dniester. There is no festive bravado or anticipation of glory in their ranks, only the grim, silent resolve of men walking to the gallows. They march to where the earth is not yet dry from the blood of their predecessors. Drumbeat. Step. Another step. The creak of heavy supply wagon wheels merges with the old commander's hacking cough. The Poles feverishly drew up defense plans, built shaky hopes on help from allies, and sent desperate dispatches to the Zaporozhian Cossacks. But all these paper intrigues and frantic tactical calculations seemed like laughable specks of dust against what was already rising on the horizon. While the doomed, sick old man led his regiments to the cold river, thousands of kilometers away, the iron-studded gates of the Istanbul palace swung open with a roar, releasing an imperial march of ambition. The Sultan hungered to grind Europe into dust. The heavy wrought-iron gates of Topkapi Palace swing open with a deafening screech. Istanbul is choking on fine dust and spring heat. The spring of 1621 brings not the blooming of gardens, but the cold clang of weapons steel. A 17-year-old youth slowly rides out onto the white marble square. Expensive silk, heavy gold harness, a cold, arrogant gaze. Sultan Osman II is not just a ruler, he is a living deity to millions. The youth is determined to surpass the military glory of his ancestors. A burning dream of world domination pulses fiercely in his young blood. This dream demands that rivers of someone else's blood be spilled immediately. A short order is given. The vast empire jolts into motion. This is not just mobilization, it is a tectonic shift of countless human masses. The war machine starts its giant, ruthless gears. 200,000 armed men converge from all corners of 3 continents. Asia, hot Africa, and submissive Europe give up their sons without a murmur. Heavy infantry, light cavalry, skilled sappers, thousands of slaves. An endless human river stretches for hundreds of grueling kilometers. The sun reflects off tens of thousands of sharp spears, blinding any onlookers. The earth literally hums. The rhythmic thud of hundreds of thousands of feet merges into a single drone. Impact. Step. It is the dull roar of an approaching earthquake. But a giant army is an incredibly gluttonous beast. 200,000 iron throats must be fed every single day. This is only the beginning of the ruthless mathematics of coming death. Add to these figures 100,000 war horses, tens of thousands of hardy camels, massive war elephants whose steps instantly crush roads into dust. The logistics of this campaign boggle the mind and break thousands of lives in passing. Wealthy provinces are picked clean just to ensure the passage of the imperial steamroller. Gold coins jingle into the pockets of quartermasters. The real price of ambition is paid in the bloody sweat and broken backs of common peasants. You are an ordinary ox driver from dusty Anatolia. Your cart is loaded to the brim with sacks of dry millet. The fierce sun mercilessly scorches your back. Road dust clogs your nose and grinds in your teeth, turning saliva into a bitter sludge. Your old ox suddenly stumbles, falls to its broken knees, and lets out a long wheeze. In desperation, you strike it with a leather whip. Your hands, covered in burst calluses, are bleeding. From behind, the elite cavalry presses forward like a solid wall. A sharp crack of someone else's whip across your hunched back. An enraged janissary screams, demanding you clear the way. You pull the groaning animal by the horns. Useless. The ox is cut down with a single stroke of a saber. Your cart and the grain are shoved into the ditch. You are absolutely useless to anyone now. The great empire indifferently steps over you and marches on. Blind imperial arrogance completely eclipses reason. In massive tents richly embroidered with pure gold, commanders leisurely sip cool sherbet. They greedily divide lands not yet conquered. As an Ottoman chronicler of the time wrote, looking admiringly at the rows of tents, Allah himself invisibly led our glorious host, and there was no force in the world capable of standing even for an hour against the righteous wrath of the commander of the faithful, whose enemies are but insignificant gnats. The flowery words sounded like a death sentence. No one discusses complex siege tactics. The generals seriously discuss only how many days it will take to sack distant Warsaw. The young sultan is absolutely certain. The cowardly enemies will flee in panic at the mere sight of his banners. But the harsh geometry of a foreign land stubbornly dictates its own rules. Pride slams into basic physics at full speed. The inevitable happens. Prolonged rains quickly turn the broken roads of the Balkans into an impassable, boggy swamp. Huge bronze cannons, capable of easily punching through stone walls, get stuck fast in the sticky mud. Wooden wheel spokes creak threateningly. Thousands of exhausted slaves harness themselves to ropes in place of fallen oxen. The speed of the march drops catastrophically. The glittering facade of the grand campaign shows its first, barely noticeable, but fatal crack. The complex chain is stretched to a dangerous limit. Carefully planned supply lines fail seriously. The perfect military machine begins to slowly devour itself, long before meeting the real enemy. However, this juggernaut is too massive to stop. It stubbornly crawls forward. It leaves behind a dead, scorched strip tens of kilometers wide. The dazzling luxury of the Sultan's tent contrasts sharply with the dysentery that is already starting to quietly mow down the lagging rearguard. The empire fundamentally ignores its first losses. It confidently carries death for others. It has no idea that a fierce death has long since come out to meet it. Some gathered an army for a parade of vanity. Others, meanwhile, dug into the frozen earth awaiting the end, but fanatical stubbornness always costs rulers more than gold. The steel steamroller was inexorably approaching a sharp bend in the Dniester River. To a small town whose name would soon become an eternal synonym for absolute slaughter. To Khotyn. Khotyn met the doomed army with an icy wind. The smell of rotten river water seeped deep under the wool of the soldiers' uniforms. The old stone fortress loomed grimly on the steep bank of the Dniester. Too small. Absolutely vulnerable to holding back an imperial legion. The sick commander-in-chief heavily dismounts. His joints crack painfully. His breath breaks into a dry cough. He stares for a long time at the high but completely useless walls. He understands a simple, cruel truth. Stone will never save you from 200,000 enemy blades. Only the earth can save you. The meager, hard Moldavian earth, which the tired soldiers will have to tear out with bare hands and blunt spades. The forced construction of the greatest trap of the century begins. This gargantuan trap no longer resembles a standard military bivouac. It is rapidly turning into a giant, pulsating snare. An 8-kilometer labyrinth of filthy death is being erected. Elite cavalrymen and simple mercenaries indifferently cast aside their pikes. They take up heavy shovels. The order is crystal clear. Dig. Dig deep. Dig as if you are stubbornly digging your own grave. Thick mud instantly clogs your pores. Bloody calluses burst with a sharp pop on the wooden handles. Chodkiewicz, burning with fever, maniacally sketches mathematical formulas for mass murder. Long trenches curve in deadly zigzags. The calculation is cold. No right angles. The attacking enemy must get hopelessly bogged down in crossfire. Deep wolf pits are carefully hidden under a thin layer of cut sod. Sharp stakes are ruthlessly driven into the boggy bottom of the ditches. Before one's eyes, the architecture of absolute cavalry denial is born. To stop any cavalry, superhuman efforts were required. After 3 weeks of maddening labor, the plain irreversibly changes its natural relief. Insane engineering thought completely subordinates the landscape. Now it is not a level field for noble knightly duels. It is a colossal grater for grinding down the imperial elite. But a huge, yawning gap remains at the junction of thick forests and new fortifications. The right flank is terrifyingly empty. As a chronicler of those terrible days wrote in despair, "We built impenetrable walls of our own flesh, but left the gates wide open for the devil." The old hetman looks anxiously at the darkened horizon. Precious time is rapidly slipping through his fingers. Without immediate reinforcements, this entire earthen fortress will be nothing but a beautifully designed mass grave. Hope hangs by an incredibly thin thread. That thread does not break. It begins to hum with the heavy thud of hooves. 40,000 grim warriors emerge from the thick forests like silent shadows. Zaporozhian Cossacks. Hetman Petro Sahaidatchny leads his impressive host in silence, without the beat of drums. They flow through the lowlands like molten liquid steel, instantly filling the empty gaps in the defense. Sahaidatchny assesses the situation with the keen eye of a predator. He immediately sees the weakest link in the general's plan. Axes ring. Soldiers furiously chop the trunks of ancient trees. They hammer together massive oak wagons. The self-assured Sultan's light cavalry will inevitably shatter against the mobile wooden wall of the Cossack tabor. The flanks are locked tight. The titanic trap has snapped shut with a clang. Inside this snapped trap, you stand knee-deep in cold clay. Numb fingers are locked onto the smooth handle of a shovel. Your strained back aches continuously. Beside you, an equally exhausted peasant breathes heavily. You are not a politician, not a brilliant strategist. You are just a cheap resource for someone else's lavish banquet. But right now, you are building a giant broiler with your own hands for those coming to kill you. Primal fear of death gradually gives way to a dull, primitive rage. Every clod of earth thrown onto the rampart is another hour won for your worthless life. You spit spitefully on your raw palms. You drive the rusty bayonet of the shovel into the stubborn ground again with force. This stubborn ground suddenly begins to vibrate slightly. A physical tremor is clearly transmitted through the thin soles of your worn-out boots. A dull roar inexorably grows with every second. The carefully constructed earthen ramparts suddenly seem laughably fragile. The massive, undefeated Ottoman army is no longer looming on the distant horizon. It is here. 200,000 soldiers, armed to the teeth, line up on the surrounding hills, literally blotting out the sky. A boundless sea of colorful tents quickly covers all the heights. The blinding glint of tens of thousands of steel blades cuts the eyes of the defenders in the filthy trenches. The perfectly calibrated imperial killing machine looks down contemptuously at this pathetic earthen labyrinth. They look at this labyrinth with unconcealed, sneering arrogance. The self-assured sultanic commanders see only a pile of frightened ragamuffins below. The young monarch, intoxicated by his own absolute impunity, orders the general assault to be sounded immediately. Why waste weeks on a boring, methodical siege when you can simply crush these moles with sheer mass? Blind imperial pride completely shuts down cold reason. They sincerely think this will be an easy morning warm-up. No one in the glittering retinue has yet understood the main paradox of the approaching meat grinder. Some naively built high towers to hold back inevitable death. Others proudly forged swords to bring it. But the one who is not afraid to mix with the mud always wins. A harsh lead rain is already packed tight into the cold barrels of the Cossack muskets. This lead rain did not take long to arrive. A deafening, bone-chilling roar of giant war horns suddenly shattered the frozen morning silence. The Ottoman imperial elite moved to the attack as if they were out for a light parade stroll through the streets of a submissive capital. Janissaries. A flawless, polished to a shine military machine. Disciplined infantry that for generations had not known the bitterness of defeat. They marched in dense, mathematically precise ranks, their shaved heads held high, absolutely confident in their invincibility. Their expensive silk banners fluttered proudly in the cold autumn wind. Their fierce battle cry was meant to send the pathetic defenders into a panicked flight before the first steel even flashed. But there was no panic on the ramparts. There was only a cold, calculating Cossack sneer. This mocking sneer materialized in the form of an ugly, mud-soaked wooden fence. The famous Cossack tabor, a mobile field fortress, crudely hammered together from heavy oak wagons, lashed together with massive iron chains. No exquisite architecture, no imperial pathos, only the dry pragmatism of survival. Behind these wagons stood men with weathered faces, blackened by gunpowder, who couldn't care less about the ancient lineages of the attackers. Strict discipline collided at full gallop with cold mathematical calculation. The Ottomans charged the supply wagons with a fierce roar, scimitars drawn. They sincerely expected the usual hand-to-hand slaughter. They expected an honest, close-quarters fight, where numerical superiority and animal strength always win. But they got a mechanized conveyor belt of death. Volley. A monstrous roar of thousands of muskets hit the eardrums simultaneously, making the earth itself shudder. Thick, suffocating white smoke instantly hid the defenders. Red-hot lead does not check for noble birth. It does not look at expensive armor. It simply methodically breaks bones. The first ranks of the attacking elite collapsed onto the filthy ground, as if mowed down all at once by an invisible giant scythe. The next charging rank stumbled at full speed over the fresh corpses of their comrades. And then another volley thundered, a continuous, steady, pulsing fire. The Zaporozhians fired almost point blank. One rank fires a synchronized shot, takes a step back. The second immediately takes its place at the embrasures, while the third feverishly rams gunpowder into hot barrels. A perfect, deadly metronome of slaughter. Impact, step, load, impact. In this moment, you are a young, strong janissary, raised since childhood for great conquests. Your heavy scimitar gleams menacingly through the ragged fog, but you don't even have time to swing for a blow. Suddenly, your whole world collapses into one blinding flash. A deafening roar permanently plugs your ears. A dull, unbearably hot jolt punches through your chainmail as easily as thin parchment. Air leaves your punctured lungs forever with a raspy hiss. You fall heavily into a sticky, churned-up puddle, convulsively gulping the icy autumn slush. Your eyes quickly glaze over, and right over you, pounding your body into the dirt with iron-shod boots, the next wave of doomed suicide squads is already running with a horrific howl. And in your final second, you realize with horror, this is not a battle between two armies. This is the industrial disposal of manpower. This methodical slaughter continued unabated for several agonizing hours. The psychological shock to the Turkish command was paralyzing. How was this even possible? Their finest elite warriors, the pride of the great Sultan, were ignominiously carpeting the earth before a line of crude wagons. Time and again, they shattered against the wooden breastworks like waves against a granite cliff, leaving behind nothing but the groans of the dying. The cold cynicism of siege arithmetic began its grim tally. Thousands of priceless lives were reduced to dry, useless statistics within the first hour of direct contact. The young monarch, watching from the safety of a distant hill, looked on in impotent fury as his invincible army became mired in a web of lead. The sudden silence felt even more terrifying than the continuous cannonade. Acrid gray gunpowder smoke drifted lazily over the field. The Ottomans wavered and fell back. The ground before the Cossack camp was completely blanketed in a vibrant carpet of expensive fabrics and motionless bodies. Blind pride had collided at full speed with a literal wall of lead and had shamefully lost the first round. But this was merely a painful, probing bite of the trap. The public realization of his own impotence was driving the Sultan to the brink of madness. How did these unwashed barbarians dare to so brazenly defy the deputy of God himself? The young leader's catastrophic mistake became irreversible in that moment. Instead of coolly regrouping his forces, he surrendered entirely to his bruised ego. Rage finally displaced military tactics. As one of the surviving mercenaries mockingly noted while shaking ash from his pipe, "They thought they came for a hunt, but they forgot to ask who the prey really was." In a fit of blind rage, the ruler ordered every single reserve to be hurled immediately at the wooden fortifications. This was no longer a simple attempt to probe the flanks. It was a mad, fanatical decision to drown a stubborn enemy in a living, pulsing mass of humanity. The massive Ottoman beast hurriedly licked its first terrible wounds, and with a bloodthirsty roar, rose to its full, gargantuan height. They were dead set on washing away the morning's shame at any cost, completely unaware that an even more terrifying surprise awaited them at the center of the defense. Hundreds of barrels had made the empire bleed, but to finally break its will, a true sledgehammer of steel was required. That steel sledgehammer was already poised over the battlefield. Sultan Osman II was suffocating with humiliation. His handsome face was twisted into an ugly mask of blind fury. The ruler of half the world simply could not accept defeat at the hands of a bunch of stubborn rebels. He issued the most brutal order of this cursed campaign: a general advance. A solid human wave surged toward the earthworks. The drums beat without stopping, a continuous, monotonous thrumming that was maddening. The Ottomans ran directly over the corpses of their fallen comrades, physically filling the deep trenches with their own bodies. The soldiers built bridges out of the dead. It was a sadistic tactic of total attrition, soft, living flesh against white-hot lead. The lead was indeed melting. Cossack and Polish muskets grew red-hot. Soldiers pissed on the scorching barrels to cool them down quickly. Pungent steam mingled with thick gunpowder smoke until there was absolutely nothing to breathe. The defenders were firing almost blind, yet it was impossible to miss that solid, advancing wall. Still, the Ottoman infantry stubbornly kept clawing their way up. As an Ottoman chronicler of those events dispassionately recorded, "Our warriors pressed forward. It was as if they were rushing to a festive banquet. They did not notice the cups filled with death. Behind that flowery Eastern prose lay a hideous reality. Thousands of men were being ground into a bloody pulp for the sake of one teenager's bruised ego. After 8 hours of continuous slaughter, the defense developed a critical crack. The grim mathematics of war took their toll. The defenders simply ran out of strength. Their hands were seized by violent cramps, and their gunpowder was nearly exhausted. Elite Turkish units suddenly breached the central sector. Sharp scimitars flashed within the trenches. The front line began to buckle dangerously into the camp. There was a real threat of the entire defense being annihilated. This was the horrific moment where chance alone could decide the fate of entire nations. Imagine yourself at the bottom of that slick trench. You're an ordinary Polish infantryman. Your long pike was broken long ago. Your face is plastered with someone else's sweat. A massive janissary leaps down directly at you, curved steel glinting in his hand. You slowly raise the splintered remains of your pike staff, realizing one simple thing. This is the absolute end. You resignedly wait for the fatal blow, closing your tired eyes. And suddenly, you hear a very strange sound. Not a scream of pain, not a loud gunshot, but a terrifying, rapidly swelling rustle, like a giant flock of predatory birds diving straight from the gray heavens. This strange sound makes the Turkish soldier turn around for a split second. That brief second saves your life. It wasn't birds rustling. It was the famous wooden wings on the backs of the heavy cavalry. Old Hetman Chodkiewicz had patiently waited for the perfect moment. He had watched the hand-to-hand struggle with cold blood. The enemy was hopelessly bogged down in the narrow passages, their formation losing its density. The hetman gave his final order. The elite of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth entered the fray. The winged hussars. Giants encased in heavy steel on massive war horses, their long, lethal lances lowered. The heavy armored wedge picked up terrifying speed. The cold earth shuddered from the horrific impact. The collision of heavy cavalry with infantry is basic physics. The massive weight ruthlessly punched right through the Ottoman ranks. The hussars slammed into the flank of the advancing Turks, cutting through the formation like a steel crowbar through rotten wood. The armored strike instantly shattered the entire structure of the enemy attack. The Ottoman infantry found themselves under heavy iron-shod hooves. Blind panic ignited instantly. A disciplined army turned into a screaming mob. No one thought about the Sultan's strict orders anymore. Men threw down their weapons in terror and ran back, trampling each other into the cold mud. The lens of history records absolute chaos. A formidable empire crumbled from a single precision strike. The triumph of cold military tactics over mindless numbers was indisputable. The campaign turned into a strategic catastrophe. The proud conquerors rolled back shamefully to their camp, having forever lost faith in their mythical invincibility. Some drove men to the slaughter for the sake of a pretty line in a chronicle. Others used heavy cavalry to strike that line out forever. But every victory has its price. The camp cheered loudly, the soldiers rejoicing at surviving that hell. However, inside the main command tent, there was dead silence. The steel sledgehammer had done its job, but the old man's hand had finally failed. While the army noisily celebrated repelling the horrific assault, a completely different tragedy was unfolding in the gloom of the general's tent. The great commander had lost his personal battle. A deadly illness finally claimed its debt, leaving the defenders alone with the icy unknown. Tomorrow was preparing an icy rage for them. That icy unknown covered the shell-pocked earth like a thick shroud. The air inside the hetman's main tent was heavy and stagnant, saturated with the smell of camphor, rotting wounds, and the slow fading of a human life. The loud cries of victory had long since died down outside the thick canvas, replaced by the monotonous moan of the autumn wind. Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, the man of iron who had stopped the imperial steamroller, could no longer even lift his own hand. A vicious fever was methodically burning him from the inside, turning his once mighty, scar-covered body into a fragile, withered husk. 71 years of continuous wars, bloody campaigns, and brutal political intrigue converged in one stifling, dimly lit tent in the middle of a besieged, artillery-plowed camp. Death was already standing at the head of his bed. It didn't wear a colorful Turkish turban or brandish a sharp scimitar. It came in the form of banal, ruthless physiology, which fundamentally ignores high military ranks. The senior officers stood in a tight, tense circle around the narrow field cot, their faces an ashen gray from chronic insomnia and poorly concealed animal terror. To lose the commander-in-chief in the very epicenter of a brutal siege was a death sentence. It was a direct path to inevitable panic, bloody mutiny, and the total massacre that would follow. The old man drew air in with a raspy whistle. Every word cost him incredible, inhuman agony. A trembling hand, covered in dark age spots, gripped the heavy, gilded hetman's mace for the very last time. This small piece of metal was the symbol of absolute power over tens of thousands of doomed lives. Slowly, overcoming the pain, he handed it to Stanislav Lubomirski. As an unknown chronicler of those events recorded with dry, piercing dread, his spirit forever departed his exhausted flesh, leaving us wretched orphans right in the open maw of the enraged beast. The faded eyes of the great hetman closed forever. The heavy news spread like wildfire through the filthy, waterlogged trenches. It was passed in low whispers, from ruined breastwork to breastwork, from smoldering campfire to campfire. At this very moment, you are an anonymous infantryman on the front line of defense. Your holy boots are soaked through in the freezing clay slush. You grip the cold barrel of your faithful musket until your hands cramp. A short phrase, cutting off all hope, reaches you. The old man's gone. Everything inside you drops instantly. Your stomach knots. The commander-in-chief is dead. Tomorrow, the enraged Turks will break through the weakened defense, and you will all be ruthlessly slaughtered, spared by no one. You look fearfully at your exhausted comrades, expecting to see the reflection of your own growing panic in their bloodshot eyes. You expect someone to be the first to throw down their heavy weapon and run away screaming. But something entirely different happens. Something that crudely breaks all known laws of military psychology. Animal fear does not turn into the panic of flight. Fear is instantly incinerated in the furnace of absolute soldierly despair, leaving behind nothing but pure, ice-cold rage. People abruptly stop whispering. The massive camp rapidly plunges into a ringing, truly eerie silence. The soldiers silently, with frightening methodicalness, sharpen their dulled sabers against wet stones. They clean the flintlocks of their muskets with maniacal intensity. Within this dense silence lies a terrifying paradox of the crowd. When the last illusory hope for a miraculous rescue from above suddenly vanishes, an ordinary man transforms into a dangerous, cornered wolf. They are no longer mercenaries of the Commonwealth. They aren't following the orders of a distant king. They are voluntary dead men with absolutely nothing to lose. The leader's death was not the expected finale, but a horrific catalyst for madness. They swear to stand on this cursed earth until the very last drop of blood. The next grim morning, the Ottomans were severely shocked. The massive imperial war machine expected to see total chaos, timid white flags, and the frantic panic of retreat. Instead, They saw a hollow, monolithic wall of men ready to personally drag anyone who dared take a single step forward into hell with them. The attempt at a new general assault met such fanatical, hollow resistance that even the grayest veterans of the Ottoman wars shuddered. The defenders didn't just shoot straight. They hacked down the approaching enemy at point-blank range with an icy, unnatural calm, without making a single sound. No loud battle cries, no deathbed curses, only the dull, rhythmic thud of cold steel against bone and the wet, squelching crunch of shattered skulls. Sultan Osman II, in a fit of impotence, broke expensive writing utensils in his luxurious tent. His perfect plan had once again shattered against an invisible barrier. The great, invincible empire had once again broken its teeth on a bunch of filthy ragamuffins who had already mentally buried themselves.
As one of the surviving European officers cynically but accurately noted, "It is incredibly easy to kill someone who desperately clings to their life, but try to defeat someone who already sincerely considers himself a dead man." The dazzling pride of the youth on the throne had collided with absolute soldierly fatalism. Some, naively, placed their hopes in gold and grand titles. Others silently drew strength from the very dark bottom of their despair. And it was this despair that proved stronger than the finest Damascus steel. But the human psyche is far from the only resource in a protracted war. Blind rage allows one to achieve the absolutely impossible in a short fight, but it is completely useless against a slow, ruthless death in the trenches. The eerie silence in the camp was soon replaced by long, drawn-out groans. Nature was preparing its own, far more terrifying blow. A long agony in the muck was already pounding authoritatively at the door, bringing with it a piercing cold, biological rot, and the slow triumph of exhaustion. This slow triumph of exhaustion did not begin with a deafening cannon volley. It began with the first drop of freezing rain. By mid-October 1621, the grey sky over the Principality of Moldavia finally burst. Endless, monotonous downpours rapidly turned the bled-out battlefield into a giant, sucking swamp. Nature was clearly tired of watching the senseless human slaughter. It decided to methodically drown both armies in their own filth. Military strategy submissively gave way to raw, animal survival. Heroic cavalry charges ceased. Exhausted soldiers no longer rushed into suicidal combat. They were just trying to stay warm. The cold cut to the very bone. Thick yellow clay greedily sucked at boots. Freezing water stood in the deep trenches, mixed with cadaverous poison and excrement. A true biological catastrophe struck. An invisible, absolutely silent enemy proved to be 100 times more terrifying than all the Ottoman artillery. Dysentery. It didn't check ranks, wealth, or military titles. It methodically mowed men down by the tens of thousands. Strong men burned up with fever, rapidly losing fluids and their minds. They wasted away into living skeletons covered in skin in just a few agonizing days. Death came quietly. A man would simply close his inflamed eyes and dissolve forever into the damp earth. The bureaucratic death machine worked flawlessly. Losses were calculated in horrific numbers. No beautiful historical feats, only the slow, utterly humiliating fading of living flesh. You are sitting at the bottom of a pit, turned to mush by the rain. You are an elite Ottoman Sipahi, a horseman from a very wealthy southern province. Your expensive silk clothes rotted away on your shoulders long ago. Your faithful, fast warhorse is gone. You look at a blackened pot over a smoldering fire. A piece of tough horsehide and scraps of your own leather tack are slowly boiling there. Your stomach is constantly seized by sharp, painful cramps. Nearby, your wounded comrade-in-arms groans quietly. He no longer has the strength even to brush the fat corpse flies away from his face. You chew the boiled horse harness slowly, with effort. It tastes like raw grave dirt. You came here to conquer a vast world. Now, your only pathetic goal is simply to survive this freezing night. 200,000 hungry mouths demanded food every day. The perfect logistics of the giant imperial machine collapsed completely. The delivery of fresh provisions stopped entirely as the roads turned into impassable bogs for heavy wagons. The massive Ottoman army began to ruthlessly cannibalize itself. Elite infantrymen fought fiercely to the death over a handful of rotten millet. The great Sultan listened to the morning reports of his commanders with unconcealed horror. The numbers of those dead from intestinal infections exceeded direct combat losses several times over. The army was melting away like March snow. Morale was finally and irrevocably broken. The conquerors had become hostages to their own incredible scale. The perfect trap had worked brilliantly, locking the dangerous predator tightly in a cage and allowing the cold to do all the dirty work. While a great empire was slowly and agonizingly dying on one bank, the situation in the defenders' earthen camp was little better. The Poles and Cossacks had completely run out of provisions. There had been no useful medicine since the very first day of the siege. Men were likewise dying by the dozens from the bloody flux and fever. But the most terrifying thing was hidden in the deep artillery magazines. The gunpowder was gone. The camp commandant looked despairingly at the last wooden barrel of black powder. It would be enough for exactly one very modest musket volley. If the enemy launched a new general assault, the defenders would have to fight back with sticks and bare hands. The situation seemed absolutely hopeless. An unconventional solution was required, a bluff of truly colossal proportions. And they staged that historical bluff. The defenders gathered the last scraps of food from across the entire massive camp. They specifically brought out the remaining skinny pigs for the enemy to see. Huge, hot bonfires were lit on the high ramparts. Loud, defiant music began to play. Exhausted, terminally ill men began to sing cheerful drinking songs. They roasted what little meat they had so that the thick, tantalizing smell would be carried by the wind directly onto the positions of the starving Turks. They laughed loudly. They clinked empty cups together, pretending to drink sweet, expensive wine. Cossacks performed boisterous, showy dances under the aim of the enemy cannons. It was absolute, concentrated mockery of death. The psychological effect of this theater of the absurd exceeded all the boldest expectations. The Ottoman sentries watched this celebration of life with wide, sunken eyes. Their inflamed minds refused to accept such a reality. They were dying en masse from hunger in the frozen mud, and these cursed trench dwellers were feasting and dancing. The Ottoman commanders reached the only logical conclusion. If the enemy was celebrating so sincerely, it meant they had plenty of supplies. It meant continuing the siege was absolutely pointless. The moral backbone of the great imperial army snapped loudly in two. No one wanted to go on the assault against these incomprehensible madmen anymore. The paradox of war revealed itself in all its brutal, cynical glory. Some were slowly perishing from starvation while sitting on chests of gold. Others were brazenly feasting over a single empty powder keg. But the winner is always the one who knows how to lie best to death's face. Sultan Osman II, with a heavy heart, called an emergency war council. The eyes of his renowned commanders were hollow. The army no longer had the strength to hold their weapons. Both stubborn sides had finally reached the point of absolute biological exhaustion. Blood no longer spilled onto the sodden earth. It simply froze in their veins. It was time to quietly sheath the swords. It was time for fake diplomatic smiles. In the thick fog, a hypocritical peace was brewing upon the ashes. This hypocritical peace crawled out of the cold morning fog, not to the sound of triumphal fanfares, but to the quiet rustle of expensive parchment. The great slaughter had reached an absolute biological dead end. Both colossal armies had physically rotted alive. There was simply no one left to fight. Swords had finally gone dull against bone. Powder magazines were emptied to the last grain. Cramped stomachs clung to spines. On the morning of October 9th, 1621, the fighting stopped. Generals from both sides stepped fastidiously over the bloated corpses of their own soldiers as they headed toward the snow-white negotiation tent. Yesterday's sworn enemies now forced smiles at one another. Politics always starts talking when the cannons run out of shot. Diplomatic cynicism worked with the flawless precision of a clockwork mechanism. The ambassadors sat leisurely at a massive oak table, politely offering each other strong black coffee and sweet Turkish delight. Outside the thin silk walls of the tent, thousands of mangled men howled in unbearable pain. Inside, refined social conversation reigned. The terms of the peace treaty were discussed with the icy calm of bizarre merchants. No global territorial concessions, no colossal monetary indemnities. The massive Ottoman war machine and the combined forces of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth simply locked into a dismal status quo. The borders remained absolutely unchanged. The Dniester River remained the silent boundary between two worlds. Nearly 100,000 human lives were uselessly incinerated in the mud just to return to the starting point, the greatest mathematical error of the 17th century. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a young clerk at the Polish embassy. Your thin, frozen fingers nervously clutch a fragile goose quill. You carefully, letter by letter, trace ornate Latin words on thick paper. Every line of this document is soaked through with the hot blood of your dead comrades. You clearly hear the fake, velvet laughter of the Turkish vizier. You see your gray-haired commander nodding submissively. You are physically sickened by this pathetic theatrical farce, but you are obligated to keep writing in silence. Your flawless calligraphy is valued much higher than an officer's honor right now. You are obediently recording a great historical lie on paper. Right now, you are helping cowardly rulers legalize their own monstrous incompetence. Black ink settles on white parchment like the cold ash of villages burned to the ground. The final period is set. The document is solemnly signed. Heavy wax seals with coats of arms are pressed hard against the paper. And then, something strikingly disgusting happens. The paper diplomatic fiction instantly transforms into loud state propaganda. As soon as the ink dries, both utterly exhausted sides immediately declare themselves the great victors. A ruler's blunder is masked as a brilliant tactical calculation. Fast messengers with joyful news race headlong toward Warsaw. Other mounted couriers gallop desperately south. Sultan Osman II proudly informs his oblivious court of an incredible triumph. He arrogantly claims he has taught the cowardly Europeans a brutal lesson. Meanwhile, the Polish commissioners also briskly report a brilliant defense of the entire Christian world. Shameless lies spread across the continent with the speed of a wildfire. Behind this beautiful screen of pompous declarations begins a hurried, almost frantic flight. Military camps are struck with indecent, frightening haste. No one wants to stay on this cursed patch of earth for a single extra minute. Soldiers abandon broken blades without regret. They leave heavy, immovable cannons in the viscous mire. They don't give a damn about government property. Yesterday's dazzling legions quietly crawl away from the field of death. They trudge heavily along the sodden roads like a pack of beaten, whimpering dogs. A dead silence slowly descends upon the cratered earth of Khotyn. Only hundreds of black ravens, with joyful, hoarse croaks, dive toward the bodies abandoned in the trenches. These birds are the only true beneficiaries of the senseless campaign that has ended. Some cold-bloodedly signed the peace to hold on to a shaky crown. Others hurriedly applied colored seals just to keep their heads. But no paper can ever resurrect people ground into dust. This hastily cooked-up compromise was not the end of a long war at all. It was merely a brief, deceptive intermission before a true, all-consuming catastrophe. Influential diplomats dryly shook hands and hurried off in different directions, carelessly leaving behind a massive, rotting ulcer on the very body of old Europe. They naively thought they had cleverly cheated history itself. But the historical process does not forgive such cheap clerical tricks. The wrath of cheated soldiers always returns, like a sharp boomerang to their commanders. The grueling return to the capital was preparing a terrifying, bloody surprise for the overconfident ruler. The diplomatic triumph on paper was rapidly twisting into a tight noose for the reformer. This tight noose for the young reformer began to constrict early. It was pressing against his neck long before the army's return. Sultan Osman II rode into Istanbul as paid heralds let out fake shouts of joy. Expensive banners swayed lazily in the wind. The horses' golden harnesses gleamed blindingly in the sun. Official chroniclers choked on routine ecstasy, diligently recording a fictional victory over the infidels. But the streets of the massive city were silent. The old capital knew perfectly well how to distinguish a true triumph from a whitewashed defeat. The great army had returned completely changed, thinned out, ragged, and incredibly angry. The elite janissaries marched across the cobblestones without pride, walking instead with the arrogant swagger of bandits. This armed mob knew exactly the critical weakness of their master. And the young monarch understood everything perfectly well, too. In the cool marble halls of the palace, it was unbearably stifling. The youth paced the empty corridors in a helpless rage. The mud of Khotyn had forever washed the gilding off his imperial ambitions. He had seen the absolute cowardice of his own troops with his own eyes. Vaunted veterans had fled in panic from the shots of simple peasants. They brazenly refused to go into a frontal assault. They threateningly demanded double pay for the slightest effort. The military system had completely rotted from within. The massive army had turned into a gluttonous, uncontrollable monster that greedily sucked the last coins from the state treasury and openly dictated its terms to the throne. The conclusion was obvious. There was only one way to save the slowly sinking empire. It was necessary to ruthlessly cut out this defiant army at the root. A plan of unprecedented historical audacity was born. The 19-year-old ruler conceived a radical, bloody reform. He firmly decided to secretly gather entirely new troops, loyal men from distant provinces. To distract his enemies, an ideal, pious pretext was invented. The Sultan publicly announced a great pilgrimage, claiming he was going to visit the holy shrines of Mecca. Under the cover of this massive journey, he planned to leave the capital, quietly arm new loyal regiments, and then return on a punitive mission to grind the arrogant janissaries into bloody dust. The scheme required absolute, grave-like silence. But in palaces, secrets live for a very short time. Experienced spies always stand behind every carved door, and information quickly leaked into the barracks. Rumors spread faster than any plague. The ruler's secret conspiracy was fully exposed. The reaction of the armed mob was lightning fast and crushing. In mid-May 1622, the Istanbul garrisons revolted. The barracks exploded in a furious, uncontrollable mutiny. Tens of thousands of enraged soldiers spilled out into the narrow streets. The air trembled with deafening curses. The dull thud of heavy boots portended catastrophe. These were no longer submissive servants of the state. This was a wild, uncontrollable pack of embittered predators. They had caught the scent of their master's fear. Palace paranoia instantly escalated into total military anarchy. The sacred aura of the monarch's absolute inviolability evaporated without a trace. A massive, roaring crowd easily crushed the weak palace guard, and the wrought iron doors of the inner chambers flew off their heavy hinges. At this fatal moment, you are standing at the doors. You are an ordinary, experienced palace guard. Your hand convulsively grips a long, sharp halberd. Your back is pressed tight against the cold marble wall. A solid wall of distorted faces is advancing right at you. You clearly see primal madness in their eyes. These people are, right now, breaking the fundamental law of the empire. They are openly raising weapons against the earthly shadow of God himself. Animal terror completely paralyzes your tired muscles. You are perfectly aware of your doom. One wrong move will cost you your life immediately. You submissively lower your gleaming weapon to the patterned floor and cowardly retreat into the saving shadows. The enraged mob bursts into the Holy of Holies without resistance. Your vaunted loyalty to the throne turns out to be a banal lie. The young master of half the world was roughly dragged from his secure hiding place. The great ruler now wallowed pathetically in the gray dust. A dirty soldier's caftan was thrown over his fragile shoulders. He was forced onto a scrawny, badly limping nag. The crowd mockingly drove him through the streets of his own capital. Simple street vendors laughed openly in his face. Former loyal viziers fearfully averted their eyes. This was a sophisticated, brutal public execution of divine status. Imperial arrogance was forever trampled by heavy soldier boots. The humiliated youth was taken to a grim prison, the famous Yedikule Castle. Its thick stone walls remembered the death rattles of many powerful captives. The road there meant an absolute, irrevocable end. The dark, damp cell reeked through and through with ingrained grave mold. Warm sunlight never penetrated here. The heavy iron door creaked open. 4 powerful men entered silently, with the hollow, expressionless eyes of professional executioners. In their coarse hands, a silk bowstring was pulled taut. No beautiful last words, no noble historical farewells, only a heavy, utterly humiliating struggle for life. The dull thuds of a young body against the cold stone floor, convulsive attempts of weak hands to break the deadly grip. The ruthless conveyor belt for eliminating the unwanted worked without a single glitch. The thin string bit into the throat with a dry snap. The eyes of the failed reformer glazed over forever in the darkness of the dungeon. A gruesome, paradoxical irony of fate came full circle. The ruler light-heartedly sent hundreds of thousands of nameless people to die, rotting in the frozen trenches of a distant foreign land. And now, he himself shamefully suffocated in a filthy cell, brutally murdered by the hands of his own mutinous soldiers. The coup d'état was completed with frightening ease. The crowd cheered noisily in the squares, naively believing in the return of long-awaited stability. They were completely unaware of the true scale of the crime committed. Some furiously destroyed the centuries-old order for the sake of momentary power. Others joyfully applauded the bloody fall of the old regime. But no one paid attention to the main thing. The foundation of the great empire was covered in deep, deadly cracks. This murder did not end the political crisis. It launched an inexorable process of long decay. This inexorable process of decay did not begin on distant borders. It started right in the cold heart of the capital. The strangling of the young ruler in a damp basement forever broke the invisible spine of the great empire. The sacred awe before the high throne vanished without a trace. The janissaries rapidly mutated. The elite, who once struck animal terror into half the world, degenerated beyond recognition.
They no longer wanted to die. The lead rain of foreign lands no longer attracted them. Frozen trenches frightened them more than any sultan's wrath. Yesterday's fearless warriors suddenly realized a much more comfortable truth. Why spill blood for the ephemeral greatness of the state when it was much easier to simply hold a curved knife to the throat of the next weak monarch? Within months, the elite guard turned into a brutal mafia cartel, arrogant racketeers in luxurious silk turbans. They openly and cynically appointed grand viziers, unconscionably emptied the state treasury, and toppled unwanted rulers with incredible ease. A street vendor brushes dust off his dirty stall with great effort. Heavy combat scimitars have finally gone dull from long idleness. Iron military discipline dissolved in sweet wine and perished in endless palace intrigues. The offensive impulse of the colossal Ottoman machine stalled forever. For centuries, the army had expanded the empire's borders like a ruthless steel roller. Now, this formidable force was terrified to leave the warm capital barracks. Fear of new trench mud paralyzed the generals. Terror of dense crossfire burned out the remnants of former courage. The bloody meat grinder of Khotyn had inflicted a deep, incurable psychological trauma on the invaders. The empire still appeared truly gargantuan on painted paper maps. Out of inertia, it continued to collect crushing taxes from conquered peoples. But inside this giant political body, insatiable corpse worms were already busy at work. The military mechanism completely stopped working for external conquest and began to work exclusively to maintain its own fat, parasitic power. The beast began to greedily devour its own tail. Meanwhile, Europe drank in this new scent of imperial weakness. Reliable rumors of the military mutiny had the effect of an exploding powder keg. For long decades, monarchs had trembled at the mere mention of the encroaching Turkish threat. They had dutifully paid humiliating tributes in gold and cowardly hidden behind the high stone walls of their castles. And suddenly, everything changed fundamentally. The churned-up, stinking Moldavian earth gave the West the most valuable resource of any war: hope. Khotyn vividly proved one simple but incredibly important theorem. The invincible Ottoman monster can be stopped. It is entirely realistic to break its fangs. It can be forced to choke on its own black blood. You are sitting in a deep leather chair. You are an old, incredibly tired Venetian ambassador. Your dry fingers pensively stroke a fresh, secret report from Istanbul. You remember the terrifying times of the past perfectly well. How arrogant viziers forced you to kneel for hours as a sign of absolute submission. You remember the sticky animal fear before every spring muster of the foreign army. And now, you read the dry lines from your agents. Guardsmen are openly looting the wealthy palaces of their own commanders. A cold, cynical smirk plays on your thin lips. You slowly pick up a sharp pen and write a dispatch to your ruler. A terminal illness has finally struck the mind of the Eastern beast. The claws are still sharp, but a gray blindness is already clouding its hazy eyes. You are personally recording the beginning of the end for the greatest continental threat. The time of humiliating blind submission is gone forever. The invincibility of the Sublime Porte turned out to be a grand bluff. This bluff shattered upon collision with the fanatical stubbornness of doomed men. The era of desperate, hollow defense had ended. Slowly but surely, the era of ruthless vultures was arriving. 38 days of continuous icy hell. 38 days of absolute biological nightmare, knee-deep in rotting human entrails. This is a brief moment by the strict standards of history, but it was precisely this moment that completely rewrote the continent's geopolitics for centuries to come. The filthy earthen trenches became the hidden foundation of the future. It was upon this foundation that the grand, crushing defeats of Turkish arms would later grow. The imperial battering ram shifted into a grinding, sharp reverse. The small crack on the bank of a swift river would now inexorably widen, crawling like a poisonous snake through the decades. It would inevitably turn into a gaping, black abyss right under the high walls of Vienna. It was there that the remnants of the Ottoman war machine would be finally crushed under the heavy, iron-shod hooves of fresh European cavalry. Another tectonic plate of human history shifted dully from its dead point. The mechanism of global collapse had been activated irrevocably. Hundreds of thousands of human lives were senselessly burned in the furnace of others' ambitions. Simple peasants became nothing more than cheap, bloody lubricant for this shift. Some built impregnable ramparts for the illusion of control. Others drove legions to certain death for a line in a chronicle. History simply stepped indifferently over their shallow mass graves, proving once again the absolute insignificance of human will before the blind law of decay. Every great state eventually chokes on its own greed. Khotyn became the perfect spatial mirror, where the aging empire saw its true, infinitely hideous face for the first time. What is more terrifying to you? To live a long, absolutely safe life on your knees before a monster dictating its rules, or to consciously rot alive in a frozen trench just to allow your great-grandchildren to finally stop being afraid of the dark?